Here we go.
Over to you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I can't see my screen, but I've got it, right. So the title of this talk, James Barry, Royal Academician and his niece, Dr. James Barry. No, this is not due to my poor grammar, as I will reveal. Do you remember Max Bygraves, anybody? He used to start his act with, I'm going to tell you a story. Well, I'm going to tell you the story about Dr. James Barry. Firstly, the Royal Academician, James Barry. Here we've got, he's here. This is James Barry. He was born in Cork in Ireland in 1741. At school, he was regarded as a child prodigy. And at 22, his painting, The King of Cashel. Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Anyway, his painting, The King of Cashel, that was there a moment ago, was exhibited in Dublin, and one of the earliest paintings of an Irish historical subject. Later, it was exhibited in London, and just 10 years later, he was elected as a Royal Academician. Now, James Barry's niece, so here we've got the Count of Cork, and James Barry's niece was Margaret Bulkeley, the daughter of his sister Mary Ann, and that's who I'm going to talk about in 19th century Cork. Margaret, his niece, was born in Cork in 1789. Now, Margaret's mother was formerly Mary Ann Barry, and she had three brothers, one of whom, of course, was the artist James, and her other brother, John, died young, and she had two other brothers, Patrick and Redmond. Margaret's father, back to Margaret, Margaret's father was Jeremiah Bulkeley, and he'd set up a grocer's shop on Merchant's Quay in Cork. Now, he'd borrowed heavily to establish his business. And he also had a post as a butter inspector at the city's weigh house, where the produce of Cork, Limerick, and Kerry was brought for grading. Here's a receipt for it, for grading and weighing. And for this, he received a salary of £140. But in 1798, Jeremiah lost his job at the weigh house when the city's weighmaster decided that he no longer wanted to employ Catholics. This was following an armed rebellion against British rule in County Mayo. So the family lost the much needed £140 salary. Now, Margaret's brother, John, was destined for a career in law, and in 1801 he went to Dublin to serve his apprenticeship. But this cost Jeremiah a further £400. Jeremiah's debt was increasing. Sometime between 1801 and 1803, at the age of just 12 or 14, Margaret fell pregnant. She and her mother went away and returned with a baby girl called Juliana, and her mother pretended the baby was hers. Margaret had been raped, but by whom? Well, it may have been her uncle Redmond Barry, who'd returned from the sea and was living with them. He had served in the Royal Navy for 40 years. He had the volatile Barry temperament. He was wild and uneducated and brutalized by life at sea. He left Cork shortly after Margaret's pregnancy was discovered. Was he run out of town? Who knows? In Dublin, Margaret's brother had fallen in love. He'd met a Miss Ward, and he needed money to marry her. He asked his father Jeremiah for £1,200 for the marriage. Jeremiah's debts were mounting. His debts were now greater than any assets he could accrue. The only remaining source of money was the house. Now, the house had belonged to Mary Ann's mother, but on marriage it became her husband's. But the full title of the house, of the property, belonged to her brother, the artist James Barry. Here he is. Now, Margaret's mother, Mary Ann, feared that Jeremiah would sell the house in order to pay off some of John's debts, and then they would be homeless. If James Barry would transfer the title of the house over to Margaret, then they would be safe. So Mary Ann got her daughter, now aged 15, to write to James Barry, her uncle. They didn't have an address for him, so they sent it to the Royal Academy. They did not receive a reply. James was no longer a member of the Royal Academy. He had been expelled. They decided to go to London and appeal to James Barry personally. The artist was living at 36 Little Castle Street. Now it's called East Castle Street. Mary Ann sent Margaret to see James. She thought he'd take pity on the young girl. She went round to the house. It was in a poor state of repair, with broken windows patched up with prints of his work. She found that he was almost as dilapidated as his house. He had no servants, so he was poorly dressed and living in just one room. He acknowledged that he'd received the letter, but he wasn't prepared to help. He was impoverished himself, he said. They didn't seem to understand. They didn't want any money out of him. They just wanted him to hand over the title of the house so that they would be safe. They returned to Cork. There they found, as they had feared, Jeremiah had signed over the rights of the house to John, and he was hiding from his creditors. They were now homeless and penniless. They were given shelter by the Cooper Penrose family at Woodhill House. The family were Quakers, and they'd been great supporters of James Barry, the artist, and they offered their home as a place for refuge for Mary Ann, her daughter Margaret, and of course the young Juliana. In the winter of 1804, Margaret and her mother went again to London to appeal to James Barry for help. He was working on The Birth of Pandora, a vast canvas some 9 feet by 17. He'd been working on it for 13 years. It was the culmination of his career. Margaret found the house in an even more dilapidated state, and the artist had clearly gone into decline, both mentally and physically. He still, however, refused to pass the legal title of the house on to Margaret. Margaret and her mother returned to Cork, where again they were taken in by the Cooper Penrose family. Meanwhile, Margaret's father, Jeremiah, had fled Cork and gone to Dublin, where his debts had finally caught up with him, and he was incarcerated in a Marshalsea prison, not a very pleasant place. On the 22nd of February, 1806, James Barry died. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral. After his death, it was discovered that despite living the last few years in a state of abject squalor and poverty, he had a substantial estate. There was no will. A search began for the next of kin. Mary Ann and Margaret set off for London again. Mary Ann engaged an old family friend, the solicitor Daniel Reardon, to fight for her claim on the estate. Meanwhile, her brother Redmond was found in a prison hulk off Portsmouth. Her other brother had died. He'd received a letter from a London solicitor informing him of his brother's death, and he too engaged a lawyer. As I say, his other brother, Patrick and Maureen, had died in the Far East. Mary Ann and Margaret stayed in London, living on monies advanced to them from the estate by the solicitor Daniel Reardon, as they awaited for the estate to be settled. Makes you think of Dickens here, anyway. And also for the paintings to be sold. Here's one of the paintings that needed to be sold. James Barry was a classical artist. They began to make friends with some of James Barry's social circle, in particular Dr. Edward Fryer, a physician, and he undertook to educate Margaret in English, French and Italian, history and geography. She had piano lessons, and this would be so that she could become a governess. In 1807, Margaret made the acquaintance of a friend of her uncle, James Barry, and this was Sarah Andrews, and she was married to General Sebastian Francisco de Miranda. General Miranda was a Venezuelan who in 1806 had raised an army to liberate Venezuela from Spanish rule, but he was defeated. Sarah employed Margaret as a governess to her 4-year-old son Leandro, and whilst the general was away trying to raise another army. In the meantime, the Barry estate had been settled and divided equally between Margaret and Redmond. In January 1808, General Miranda returned to England and Margaret met him with Dr. Fryer. The general was impressed with this young girl and agreed to provide a character reference for her future employment as a governess. But it was difficult for her to get a position as a governess without family connections, and it is particularly difficult for an Irish Catholic girl from a poor background. In the meantime, she continued to tutor the general's young son, Leandro, and enjoyed use of the general's extensive library of some 6,000 books. That's more than Stour Head, just down the road. It soon became clear that Margaret was a bright girl and had a passion for learning. That year, 1808, Mrs. Bulkeley received a letter from her son, John. He had left his legal training and his wife, and he was now in the army. And as a private in the Royal York Rangers, they used to recruit from prisons and prison hulks, and he was in the hold of a ship bound for the Caribbean and was pleading for help. Mrs. Bulkeley did not reply. But Margaret did. She offered her brother little sympathy for his plight, and she suggested that to die for his country was noble. And she added, "Was I not a girl, I would be a soldier." Still in London, Dr. Fryer, Daniel Reardon, and General Miranda conceived a plan. They reasoned that if this bright young girl could disguise herself as a man, she could go to university and train to be a doctor. Once qualified, she could go and work in the newly liberated Venezuela. In General Miranda's Venezuela, men and women would be equal, and there she could practice medicine as herself. Now, of course, women couldn't train to be doctors in Britain at this time. In fact, it was not until 1876 that women were allowed to enter the medical profession. So in 1809, it was decided that Margaret should disguise herself as a man and go and train to be a doctor at the Edinburgh University with the help of the Earl of Buchan. And here he is. Now, he'd been a great admirer of James Barry, and in fact, he'd helped James Barry financially when he was sacked as a member of the Royal Academy. But more importantly, he was a benefactor of the university. This is long before A-levels, the University of Edinburgh, and he agreed to be her sponsor at the university. Now, the Earl was in his late 60s. He was eccentric with progressive, radical views. But more importantly, he was most influential at the university. So Margaret's disguise began. She went from wearing comfortable floaty dresses to second-hand men's clothes. Her hair was cut short in fashionable Caesar style. It was decided that she should be Mr. James Barry, the son of Mrs. Bulkeley's brother John, who died years ago. Mr. Barry would be accompanied by his aunt, her mother. Margaret / James registered for courses in anatomy, chemistry, natural philosophy, and Greek at 3 guineas each, and studied hard at Edinburgh Medical School. Margaret / James also did ward rounds at the infirmary, followed by additional lectures in military surgery, not quite sure what the difference is, but midwifery, dissection, and medical botany. I'm now going to refer to Margaret as James, because that's the identity that she had assumed. I keep saying Margaret / James doesn't really work. So I'm going to say that James studied hard for 3 years. To write his dissertation, which had to be in Latin, he stayed at Dryburgh Abbey on Lord Buchan's estate for 5 weeks. That is a copy of Margaret / James's dissertation. James finally qualified as a doctor. Margaret had kept up the disguise for 3 years. Now she could return to her true self and practice as a doctor in the newly liberated Venezuela. But her plans were thwarted. General Miranda had returned to Venezuela with Simon Bolivar to overthrow the Spanish government and free the country. But Miranda's idealism was at odds with Bolivar's authoritarianism. Oh, I've done it again. I've spoken to both my sons. Hold on a moment, I'll have to stop that. James, I'm lecturing. Talk to you later. Sorry, don't know what you do about that. Don't phone me. Right, so we're back to General Miranda in Venezuela with Simon Bolivar. They had difference of opinion, and in fact, Simon Bolivar betrayed General Miranda. Miranda was accused of treason, handed over to the Spanish authorities, and was taken back to Spain and imprisoned in Cadiz and never released. Margaret could not now renew her life as a woman. Her dresses remained in her trunk. She went back to being Dr. James Barry and decided to pursue further knowledge at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, where he studied pharmacology under the apothecary Richard Whitfield, and also surgery under the well-known surgeon Astley Cooper at Guy's Hospital. Margaret maintained her disguise, but continually feared discovery of her true identity. And perhaps it was that fear that prompted her to apply to join the army as a surgeon. Now, she gave her age as 18 rather than her actual age of 24, but she looked only about 14. In June 1813, James's first posting was to the military hospital in Chelsea. He stayed there for 4 months, treating many wounded soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars. He wore a uniform, a red jacket, spurred boots, and carried a shiny sword. The boots had 2-inch heels to add height to his diminutive frame, and his jacket was padded out to try and give some bulk to his frame, and to make him look a little bit more masculine. His next posting was to Devonport, where he stayed for 3 years. Following the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, James had many casualties requiring treatment. On the 30th of July, he saw Bellerophon sail by with Napoleon on his way to St. Helena. On the 7th of December, James was promoted to assistant surgeon to the forces and commissioned a miniature portrait of himself in his uniform. In August of 1816, James was posted to the Cape of Good Hope. Lord Buchan gave him a letter of introduction to Lord Charles Somerset, the governor of the Cape. So here we are off to South Africa. I don't need to show you where South Africa is, and here's the Cape. On arrival, James reported to the principal medical officer at the military hospital, then found lodgings, and then he took the letter of introduction to the governor, Lieutenant General Lord Charles Somerset, and here he is. Lieutenant General Lord Charles Somerset had been governor since 1811. His wife, Elizabeth, had died the previous year in 1810, leaving him with 2 teenage daughters to care for. Shortly after James's arrival, Lord Charles's daughter, Georgina, was unwell. 3 doctors attended her, but she didn't improve. Lord Charles asked James to treat her. James stopped all previous medication and carried out his own treatment. Georgina recovered. Lord Somerset's admiration and gratitude were immense, and James became a close friend of the governor, plus Georgina and her sister Charlotte. Following year, James accompanied the governor and his daughters on a tour of the colony. Upon their return, Lord Somerset appointed James to be physician to his household, and installed him in a cottage within the grounds of his residence. He was also appointed physician to the Vaccine Institute at the Cape, in addition to his actual job as assistant surgeon to the forces. In 1818, Lord Charles was taken ill. He probably had dysentery and typhoid. James nursed him, bathed him, and cared for him. After 18 days of personal care, he began to recover, and their friendship deepened. Now, Dr. Barry was acknowledged as an excellent doctor, but he was not an easygoing character. He was described as irascible, abrasive, and bad-tempered. Now, this may have just been a Barry characteristic, for his uncle was equally bad-tempered, but it was obviously, well, in my view, possibly exacerbated by the tension of keeping up his disguise. Maintaining his male persona was certainly stressful, and sometimes he made mistakes in his role as a man. In 1819, James was sitting in the outer office of Government House waiting to see the governor. Also waiting there was Captain Clerta of the 15th Hussars. An attractive woman went ahead of them into the governor's office and was there for quite some time. In an attempt at masculine banter or humour, Dr. Barry said to Captain Clerta, "I say, Clerta, that's a nice Dutch filly the governor's got hold of." Clerta was horrified. It was just not done for an officer to make such personal comment about a woman, and demanded that James retract the comment. James refused and challenged Captain Clerta to a duel. What chance would he, or in reality she, have against a trained soldier? Pistols were the chosen weapons. They met at dawn. The seconds inquired whether either of them would apologise or retract their statements. Neither would. They stood side on to each other. A surgeon attended. He had his instrument case open, ready to treat any injuries. The signal came, a quick flutter of a white handkerchief. Both fired. James's bullet struck Clerta on his forehead, but fortunately it was deflected by his helmet, his shako or shako. I say shako, but you may know better. So he was all right, but James was hit on his thigh. The surgeon rushed forward to treat him. First, he needed to cut away his breeches. James panicked. He insisted on binding the wound himself back in his cottage. He feared his true female identity would be revealed. Fortunately, it was only a flesh wound. A major injury would have required treatment by a doctor immediately, and thus it would have been discovered that he was not a man. In 1820, Lord Somerset returned to England on leave. General Dawkin was appointed as governor in his absence. Dawkin was a very different character to Somerset, somewhat abrasive and dictatorial. Shortly afterwards, a Royal Naval vessel arrived from Mauritius with the news that there was cholera on the island. This was the first time the disease was evident outside of India. Dawkin dispatched James Barry to Mauritius, which only took 2 weeks. By the time James arrived, the epidemic was almost over, but the 56th Regiment of Foot had suffered dreadfully. There had been 138 cases in the regiment. There was little left for James to do, and he soon returned to the Cape. The following year, Lord Charles returned from leave with a new young wife who was pregnant. 2 years later, James was appointed Colonial Medical Inspector. He was now responsible for civilian hospitals, plus the Department of Lepers, the prisons, the lunatic asylum, the impoverished sick, plus control of drugs and medicines. He was also responsible for quarantine regulations and certifying the qualifications of surgeons, midwives, and apothecaries. James inspected the leper colony and reported that the medical treatment of lepers is so entirely neglected that, as far as I can learn, no attempts to care for the lepers have been made. They were hungry, they received inhumane treatment, and were forced to labour in the gardens. James inspected Somerset Hospital, the lunatic asylum. Once again, he found appalling conditions. James's report, some 50 pages long, stated, "The lunatics are in the most squalid and wretched condition that can be imagined." Following his report, improvements were made. "The prisons," he wrote, "resembled medieval dungeons, no beds, no buckets, no furnishings at all, and there seemed to be no medical attention at all for the prisoners." There was much opposition to his attempts to improve these conditions, but he persevered. James grew closer to Lord Somerset, but this was attracting attention. On the 1st of June 1824, a notice appeared on a bridge. I hope you could read this. I'll read the first bit. "A person living at Newlands makes it known, or takes this method of making it known to the public authorities of this colony, that on the 5th of May he detected Lord Charles..." I'll leave you to read that bit. "Accusations of a sexual relationship with the governor. Such acts were not only illegal, but punishable by death." The contents of the notice spread rapidly. Large rewards were offered for the capture of the culprits. A court of inquiry was launched. There were 4 suspects whose grievances against the governor, but no evidence of guilt could be found. James and Lord Charles were very close. Had the governor discovered that James was in fact a woman? Had they had a relationship and been discovered in a compromising position? Who knows? In 1826, Lord Charles left the Cape. James attended the parting ceremony. Troops were lined up and crowds of spectators lined the streets. James went on board to say his own personal farewell. Their close relationship remained a secret. That summer, James was called out in the middle of the night to Thomas and Wilhelmina Munich's house. Wilhelmina had been in labour all day and all night. This was a much longed-for baby. They had been married for 10 years. She had lost one baby and was desperate to give birth to this one, but there were clearly problems. James tried a forceps delivery, but that proved impossible. A caesarean was required. Now, at that time, there had been no caesarean birth in Britain, already aware in the British Empire, if I'm allowed to say that, following which both mother and baby had survived. Mrs. Munich was held down. She was given a leather strap to bite on, and the baby boy, here he is at night, and the baby boy was delivered. The operation was a success. Both baby and mother survived. This was the first successful caesarean procedure. I've double-checked on American medical sites, and they still quote Dr. Barry as carrying out the first successful procedure. Further, the mother didn't succumb to any kind of infection. James's strong views on hygiene, he advocated clean hands and clean instruments. That's a good idea. May well have been a contributory factor. The Munichs offered him a large fee. James refused it, but said if they wished to thank him, they could name the boy after him. And so the baby was christened James Barry Munich, and James was a godfather. As a gift, James gave them his miniature portrait. And the name James Barry continued in the family. And in 1924, it was the name of the Prime Minister of South Africa. James was now 37, but he still looked much younger. He'd already told people that he was born in 1799, taking 10 years off his actual age. I think I might try that. But his youthful appearance did attract notice. In the absence of Lord Charles, James was lonely. He began writing a paper on a cure for VD, the perennial curse of all garrison towns. The treatments used at the time were just too horrendous to detail, but his interest in botany gave him a focus for a new treatment. On the 22nd of November 1827, James was promoted to full staff surgeon in the equivalent rank of major, and his salary doubled. James had been at the Cape for 12 years. Under his tenure, there were noticeable improvements in the health and the care of the lepers, the insane at Somerset Hospital, the prisoners in the Tronc. He implemented a full vaccination program, and he also instigated improvements in sanitation and water systems. In August 1828, James was posted to Mauritius. There were 1,500 men and officers in the garrison, plus 500 wives and children to care for. Dysentery was endemic on the island. A year later, James received news that the Earl of Buchan had died, aged 86. There was worse to come. James heard that Lord Somerset was dangerously ill. Here's the two of them. Without warning or seeking any kind of permission, James abandoned his post and caught the next ship sailing for England to go and care for Lord Somerset. Lord Charles was aged 62, and by the time James reached England, he was unable to walk very far because of shortness of breath. His feet and lower legs were swollen. James took care of Lord Charles, but his brother decided that a second opinion was required and brought in Sir Henry Halford, who advocated travelling to Bath to take the waters. James disagreed, but of course he was overruled by the more senior doctor, and the treatment didn't help Lord Charles anyway. 2 weeks later, James persuaded Lord Charles to go to the seaside for some fresh air and seawater baths, and so they went to Brighton, which of course was the height of fashion at the time, a favourite of George IV. Lord Charles died a week later at the Bedford Hotel. James had lost not only a friend, but a man who'd been his benefactor, protector, surrogate father, maybe more. On the 25th of April 1831, James departed for his next posting and sailed for Jamaica. He arrived at Kingston on the 12th of June 1831. He was stationed at Upart Park, which was just 2 miles inland from Kingston. Jamaica was not a healthy place. There were many cases of yellow fever and malaria, for which, of course, at that time there was no cure. The garrison lost 300 men a year. That was 10 times more than James Barry had experienced at the Cape, 300 men a year from illness. Well, James settled into the military and medical and social life of the island. He was invited to dinners at the governor's residence, where it was reported he told outrageous stories and portrayed himself as quite a lady killer, always attaching himself to the finest, best-looking women in the room. This was perhaps to keep up the disguise that he was a man, for at barely 5 foot tall, with smooth skin and the high-pitched voice of a woman, he needed to keep up the pretense. He was considered somewhat eccentric. He didn't drink. Instead, he drank milk, and he only ate fruit, and he kept quite a menagerie of pets. He continued to be irritable and impatient and quarrelsome with those in authority over him, particularly with those in authority. And in Jamaica, he took on a new servant, a manservant, a young black soldier of the West Indian Regiment called John. And of course, not only at the time, John would stay with him for the rest of his life. In February 1835, James departed for his next posting to St. Helena, but first sailed to England. Now, I'm basing my talk on the biography that was written by Michael Dupreece, a retired surgeon in South Africa who spent 10 years studying Dr. Barry, and he can find no record of him for a year and 2 months in England. Maybe he went to Cork, where his mother had fallen on the hard times and was now in the workhouse in Cork. James is certainly open to criticism for the care of his mother. She had sacrificed everything to enable him to become a doctor, and there's no record of him helping her financially in any way. And in fact, he'd cut off all ties with her in 1813. Now, Mrs. Bulkeley was well known in Cork. Her admission to the workhouse was printed in the local paper that was copied on to other papers in Ireland and even in newspapers in England. Did James read about her situation in the newspaper? Did he get her released? If he did, was it as Dr. Barry or as her daughter Margaret? Well, perhaps he did, for shortly afterwards she left. Was recently released from the workhouse, one of the very few to do so. Once you were there, you didn't leave. So, and she said she returned to England. Now, on the 19th of April, 1836, James sailed for St. Helena. Where on earth was St. Helena? I found it on a map. There it is, in the middle of the South Atlantic. A passenger on board was found to have smallpox. The disease began to spread. Curse of the 19th century. Now, the ship couldn't dock at St. Helena with such contagion, as there were no quarantine facilities on the island, and so it was diverted to the Cape. At the Cape, passengers were stripped and sponged with vinegar or sodium hypochlorite. Clothes were fumigated with chlorine gas. James was fortunate that he was allowed to sponge and dress himself in private, and so still able to maintain his disguise. At the Cape, all passengers and crew were taken ashore, where the confinement began. James had lost everything. All his uniforms, his civilian clothes, his books, his papers, all personal possessions were gone, including those 3 pillows which bulked out his jacket to make him look, give some masculine bulk to his body. It was 2 months before James finally sailed for St. Helena, where he was met in Jamestown by Dr. Hopkins. James's role was to oversee the regimental surgeons, to provide care to the rest of the garrison, and to inspect an average of 2 ships a day, along with Dr. Hopkins. There were about 5,000 people under his care. This was a poor island, and the wages were low, and slavery was still enforced. James inspected the 91st Highland Regiment Hospital and found it clean and well arranged. But the civil hospital was quite different. Conditions were utterly unacceptable. Once again, James clashed with those in authority. The governor didn't want to spend any money on the medical care of civilians. James was oblivious to the politics of it. He was just concerned about the health and welfare of the sick. So James was soon in dispute with the commissary. He asked for medical supplies. This was refused. So James wrote to Lord Glenelg, the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, bypassing both the governor and the St. Helena authorities, wrote to him to complain. So that on the 20th of November 1836, James was arrested and charged with conduct unbecoming and the character of an officer and a gentleman. At his court-martial, James conducted his own defence. He was found not guilty, and in the end, the Treasury ordered the Commissariat to supply the civil hospital. In St. Helena, James's secret was again threatened to be revealed. Gossip circulated that James was a woman. His laundress decided to prove it for herself. She was going to spy on James as he bathed. Well, James must have heard something, for he rushed out with a crop in his hand and beat the laundress as he caught her red-handed. James spent 2 years on St. Helena, and he sailed back in July 1838. James was now the 6th most senior staff surgeon in the British Army. Back in England on Wednesday, the 18th of July, James travelled to St. James's Palace to attend a reception hosted by Queen Victoria. Here was this poor Irish girl, now a woman, of course, in the company of various members of the European royalty and nobility, plus generals, admirals, clerics, lords, knights, all of them waiting to be presented to the Queen along with Dr. James Barry or Margaret Barclay. But the doctor's next posting was to Antigua as the island's medical officer. The military weren't based in St. John's, but at English Harbour. His Antigua and his English Harbour. And the hospital was at Shirley Heights. There was a total garrison of between 5,000 and 6,000 men. As well as treating men with malaria and yellow fever, James also had to treat men who had been flogged. It had been banned for slaves, but it remained a common punishment for British soldiers, sometimes requiring hospital treatment. In 1840, James was posted. Here's a scene of some poor soldier being flogged. In 1840, James was posted to Trinidad. Now we've got Trinidad. There he found that the hospital was located near a swamp. Perhaps not surprisingly, mortality rates were high. James succumbed to malaria and was taken in by a female friend who cared for him. He made her promise that if he should die, his body must be wrapped in the sheet in which he had expired and buried without examination. He added that no medical subordinates were to visit him. But Dr. O'Connor decided he would visit with a friend, Lieutenant Robert Lowry. O'Connor went into James's bedroom and found him in a deep sleep. He began a routine examination. He drew back the sheets to listen to his chest. James's secret was revealed. O'Connor shouted to Lowry, "Barry is a woman." Dr. Barry woke up. He was devastated that his secret was out. He pleaded with them not to tell a soul. But in 1845, James fell ill again. This time he had yellow fever. He recovered, but he was left debilitated. Later that year, he returned to England and began his long recuperation. But in November of that year, James sailed to Malta, his next posting. Malta had been a British colony since 1814, and Dr. Barry was to be the principal medical officer on the island. He took lodgings in Slima. Now, he had 3 hospitals under his direct control: Station Hospital, the small Chambray Hospital on Gozo, and the great Sacra Infirma on Valletta Harbour, built in the 16th century by the Knights of St. John. In 1847, there was a real fear of a cholera epidemic. There were several cases with typical symptoms. If cholera was declared on Malta, it would ruin trade. So doctors had to be absolutely sure before a diagnosis was given. The fear, of course, was Asiatic cholera. The Board of Health was convened, headed by James, and he made the political decision and declined to declare a cholera epidemic. But 2 years later, cholera arrived without any doubt. There was cholera in Vienna, Venice, Prague, and Algiers, and Malta was not going to escape. Within 2 weeks, there were 82 cases, 62 deaths. It was especially virulent amongst children. By the end of July, the 44th Regiment had lost 65 men, 10 women, and 9 children in the hospital at Floriana Barracks, far more than other barracks. James was convinced, as you would be, that the open sewer and poor drainage contributed to the higher rate of disease, his Floriana Barracks. Once again, James took on the authorities and recommended that the barracks and hospital be abandoned. The Commander-in-Chief disagreed, as did the Governor, so James went over their heads and wrote to Earl Grey, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. By early October, the epidemic was in decline, and by the end of the month it was over. But there had been 4,029 cases, and there had been 1,736 people had died. James received a letter of thanks from the Duke of Wellington for all his hard work during the epidemic, and James treasured that letter for many years. The following year, we're up to 1851 now, James was posted to Corfu. He'd been in Malta for nearly 4.5 years. In Corfu, there were 4 infantry regiments, plus artillery, and several hospitals. James was appointed Deputy Inspector General of Hospitals in the equivalent rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He was now the most senior first-class staff surgeon in the army. Dr. Barry was now in his 60s and looked it. He was considered to be an elderly eccentric with his odd diet and teetotalism, but he was irascible, a tyrant to his subordinates, but caring and kindly to his patients. He was obsessed with cleanliness. Also living in Corfu at that time was Edward Lear, who produced a caricature of the doctor. And here it is. Edward Lear, the writer of the nonsense rhymes and a traveller and artist. After a year in Corfu and a total of 6 years in the Mediterranean, James departed for 10 months home leave. James's connection with the Somerset family had continued since the death of Lord Charles. His younger brother, Lord Fitzroy Somerset, was raised to a baronry and became first Baron Raglan of Ragland. Here he is. James was included in the family celebrations. James returned to Corfu in March 1853, date that should ring with you historians. On the 5th of October 1853, the Crimean War began. James asked to be posted there, but was refused. Lord Raglan was given command of the Eastern Army and in February 1854 sailed to join the Anglo-French force in the Black Sea. There were now 10 regiments in Corfu, preparing for action in the Crimean War. In October 1854, at the Battle of Balaclava, there was, of course, the charge of the Light Brigade, followed by the Battle of Inkerman. The casualties were dreadful, not just from injuries, but from cholera too. James offered his hospitals in Corfu for the care of the wounded. And during the winter of 1854, 500 men, casualties of Alma, Inkerman and Balaclava, arrived in Corfu to convalesce, including 462 men from Scutari. On arrival, the patients were ragged and unclean. But 3 days later, a missionary reported everyone seemed much improved and was clad in hospital dress. His regime of care was highly successful. After 2 weeks, 53 were fit for service, 63 for light duties, and 69 were up and walking. Only 17 died. This was testament to James's management and commitment to hygiene and excellence as a doctor. James decided to go to Crimea himself and see the conditions for himself. I think we all know where Crimea is now, but here's an old map. He went to Scutari, where Florence Nightingale was administering to the sick and wounded. Now, on a personal note, I confess I didn't realise that Scutari was on the other side of the Black Sea. So those poor soldiers injured had to sail across the sea before they got to Florence Nightingale. Which is a bit tough. Anyway, when James arrived, it was a hot and sunny day. And as he rode across the parade ground, he noticed a young woman walking towards them. And despite the heat of the sun, she wore only a simple cap, which in James's opinion was quite inadequate. He scolded her harshly for being out in the sun without a hat, subjecting her to a long lecture in front of a group of onlookers. The young woman, of course, you could guess, was Florence Nightingale. She recalled, "He behaved like a brute, the most hardened creature I ever met." He didn't stay long in Scutari. It probably wasn't welcome. He sailed on for Crimea. He'd been an army surgeon for many years, but he'd never seen a real war. Balaclava had been a nondescript village by the sea, but after a year of military traffic, it was now a scene of mud, hovels, disease, and despair. It was another 8 miles to the front at Sevastopol, where the army held the line. Oh, incidentally, it was between Balaclava and Sevastopol that Mary Seacole worked with sick and wounded soldiers, and in the sobriquet, the Creole with the tea mug. James went to the front line. He found our camp hospitals undersupplied and overstretched. He spent 3 months working there. He left in January as the war was coming to an end. In March, a peace treaty was signed, and James returned to Corfu. But on the 23rd of June, 1857, James left the island. And when he left, the hospitals in Corfu were in a better state due to the improvements that he had made. James's next posting was to Montreal. He arrived on the 3rd of November, 1857, a very cold introduction to a Canadian winter. He took lodgings in Sherbrooke Street. He was promoted to Inspector General of Hospitals in Canada, an equivalent rank of Brigadier General. There he fought for better food, sanitation, and proper medical care for soldiers and their wives. Up to that point, the wives were excluded. In February 1859, James was ill with bronchitis. He was now age 70. He applied to be temporarily relieved of his duties. He returned to England, accompanied by his manservant John. He arrived in Liverpool. Back in London, he was ordered to appear before a medical board, after which he was relieved of his post due to ill health and was put on half pay. James appealed against the decision, but was turned down. He was now without a job and very little income. When James recovered his strength, I really don't understand this bit, but anyway, James went to Jamaica on holiday, taking John, his servant, with him. He stayed at one of the army camps in Kingston, and there he had a photograph taken. Here he is on the right-hand side with John, his servant. James returned to England and settled in London. With little income, James found himself in reduced circumstances and rented a room in Marylebone. On the 24th of July, 1865, James fell ill. He had endemic diarrhea, maybe cholera. He died the following day, age 76. Dr. Barry had stated he wished to be buried in the bed linen in which he died, but his wishes were ignored. His landlady brought in a charwoman to wash the body and lay it out for burial. Sophia Bishop pulled back the bedclothes and began to wash the body. Hello, there was something odd about this old gentleman. There was definitely something missing. And what was more, there were distinct striations on the skin of his belly. She had marks like that herself. They came from childbearing. I think we call them stretch marks now. And thus the secret was out. Sophia Bishop Sophia Bishop was not paid for her work, so she went to see Dr. Barry's own doctor, Dr. McKinnon, and confronted him with her discovery and demanded payment for keeping the secret. Dr. McKinnon refused. He refused to be blackmailed, and so the woman took her story to the press. The public was shocked to hear that this renowned and respected doctor who'd served in the British Army for over 40 years was, in fact, a woman. Seeking to suppress the scandal, the British Army sealed all records relating to Dr. James Barry, not for 10 years, not for 20 years, but for 100 years. The funeral was on the 29th of July at Kensal Green in northwest London. And so, to recap, Margaret Bulkley, James Barry, was the first woman to become a doctor, graduating in 1812 from Edinburgh University. There he was thought to be a boy. Dr. Barry was the first doctor to perform a successful caesarean procedure, following which both mother and baby survived. Dr. Barry was a pioneer in hospital reform and hygiene, and was a vigorous campaigner against slavery. He or she Undoubtedly had been a professional, proficient doctor with excellent managerial and organizational skills and a good bedside manner, but was tactless, impatient, argumentative, and bad-tempered, just like her uncle before her. And finally, she was the first woman to reach the rank of general in the British Army. And that's the end of my story. Thank you very much. This is the book that I've taken my knowledge from, and it's well worth reading. An absolutely fascinating read. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Felicity. That was absolutely fascinating.
I was given the book to read. I was lecturing down in Dover, and I stayed with a friend, and I'd gone by train. She said, "What are you going to read on the way back?" I said, "Oh, I'll read the paper and then probably doze off." And she said, "Why don't you read this book? I think you'd find it interesting." And I read it for 4 hours non-stop. It's just absolutely fascinating. So I thought it would make an interesting story for other people.
But yeah. you said, Felicity, that they found stretch marks on her. Yeah. Is there any record of her having a child?
Yeah. You may recall I said she was raped when she was about 12.
Oh, right. Okay.
And she went away with her mother, and they came back with the baby Juliana. And there's no Dr. Michael Dupreez has not been able to find out anything about Juliana. She didn't seem to care for her. The only record they could find of Juliana Bulkley was as an advert that she would do sewing for you, a seamstress and so on. But he didn't do anything for her at all. But I suppose didn't feel much having been raped.
Right. Oh. And St. Helena was where Napoleon was exiled to.
That's right, but yes, he was there till he died in 1821, didn't he? Whereas James went there much later.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. Has anybody got any questions? If you have, please demute yourself and please ask away.
Are these army members going to Ukraine?
Just a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, yeah. Just a comment. The intake to medical schools now is there's more females than males.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
What a shame she doesn't know that.
Yes, quite. And how it's so much earlier. I mean, it's 1876 that women were allowed to enter the medical college. I did some research. The first woman, to attend the Royal College of Surgeons, that was at 1906. And the first woman to be appointed a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons was 1911. They missed out on an awful lot, didn't they?
Unbelievable.
I have a comment as well.
Our way.
I wrote I wrote a historical fiction novel about a woman in the British Army. And it was featured on an 18th century blog, and someone commented about a female surgeon that they thought she was in the Navy. And I said, I hadn't heard anything about that, but I'm pretty sure that that it must have been Dr. Berry that they were talking about.
Yeah, I would reckon so, because I've done quite a bit of research into the British Navy or the Royal Navy. I don't know of any women doctors in the Navy, but then again, I didn't know about Margaret Bulkley, an army doctor, but it's well researched, and everybody tells me there's a film about it, but I've never seen it. The film about her, I've never seen it, and I don't even know what it's called. But usually when I give a talk, someone says, "Oh yes, there's a film," but I imagine they strayed away from the reality. There's a second book about Dr. James Barry that is much more recent, and it's so yes, it's fully woke because the person writing it reckons that she was she was transitioning or something like that. I don't believe she was. I think she may have had a relationship with the governor, Charles Somerset, Lord Somerset. But I mean, what else was she to do? She had nowhere to go. Her home had been sold. Her father was in debtor's prison, and here she had an opportunity to work as a doctor. But otherwise, if she returned to being a woman, she couldn't be a doctor, and what could she do? So I don't believe that she was a hermaphrodite or transitioning or anything like that, but we made it better.
Trevor, as a South African, have you got any questions at all? You're gonna have to demute yourself. That's it.
I can't think of anything. It was an extremely comprehensive talk, and I hadn't heard very much. I'd heard about the doing the first caesarean section, for example, and that JBM Herzog had the first names of James Barry, which I only learned quite recently. You know, there's a major highway named after him in Johannesburg, and I never realized that that's why he just used his initials. Because he was an Afrikaner, and those, of course, are very English names. And yeah, a magnificent talk and fascinating. And I didn't realize that, in fact, she had worked in so many different parts of the world.
Yes, yeah.
And also been a second Florence Nightingale, if you like, in what should we call it, hospital administration, and how important that is.
Well, yes, Michael Dupreez reckons that if Dr. Barry had organised the medical services in Crimea, they would have been better, would have been better than what Florence Nightingale achieved, because he was a very good organiser and administrator. He believes she would have done a better job.
Yeah, well, of course, you can only speculate, can't you?
Yeah, exactly. And then Florence had the backing of the, British, aristocracy and politicians and so on. Yeah.
But she took to her bed soon after, didn't she?
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So lived as an invalid for, I think, the next 60 years.
Years and years. Yes. Yeah.
And wasn't involved in the hands-on administration that James Barry was.
No, exactly. And I mean, it was rather. I mean, the hospital at Scutari was in a very odd place, wasn't it?
I never realised that. I always thought.
Oh, good. I'm glad you said that, because I didn't either. So those poor souls, they were already injured or very ill with cholera, and they had to sail across to Scutari, which had been an old army barracks, but was not in a very healthy place at all. Possibly Dr. Barry would have found somewhere better, possibly on Crimea.
I can't quite understand why he went to holiday in Jamaica.
No,
that's bizarre.
Particularly as he was, clearly not a well person, and 70-odd years of age. Just sailing across it at that time would be rough, I would have thought. Well, literally rough, but difficult.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I can't find any reasoning for it.
Just wanted to see it again, perhaps.
Yes.
People do feel like that sometimes.
And someone said perhaps he wanted to take his servant John back. But as far as I understand, John was with him right to the very end. So, didn't know.
Yeah. Anybody else got any questions? Who's down here, Louise or Jill or Terry?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So yeah, I'm also South African. So I had very little idea that Dr. Barry had spent as much time, particularly in Cape Town, because I come from Cape Town. So that was very interesting for me. I really knew very little, and likewise, thoroughly enjoyable presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isn't there still a hospital called the Somerset Hospital?
I wouldn't honestly. Well, there's a whole suburb called Somerset West.
Right.
No, there's a Somerset Hospital.
There is a Somerset Hospital. Yeah, I was wondering when you referred to the hospitals. I know there's that hospital on where, is it called Victoria Hospital in Cape Town? Maybe Trevor, you know. I don't know if that was a hospital.
I don't know about that one. The Somerset Hospital is near the V&A waterfront.
Yeah, that prison was, right? And
it's still in use, I think.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Is it a medical hospital or a hospital for the insane? I don't know.
I do believe I heard that it was a hospital for the insane, but I'm not sure when and where it would have changed over to the prison, or whether it's connected or next to. I'm not really sure.
Right.
I'm going back in December. I'll go and have a look.
Well, or when this is over, you Google it and you can find
that's not fun. You got to go there. You're right.
I think I did Google it. I know I'm pretty certain there's a Somerset Hospital, but I didn't know what kind it is.
No, I don't know anymore either. And it was also interesting because I live in Canada, so there was the double reference there.
Yes. Yeah.
What a change to the cold, freezing Montreal.
Yeah, quite. To arrive on that date. And then also the fact that no one looked after the wives, and they were in the same sort of wards as the men, which were, oh well, I mustn't say anything. I mean,
I think, Trevor, we're outnumbered here. We got loads of ladies, so we better be careful what we say.
Yes.
Anything else, Prue or Jill? Have you got anything you want to ask Felicity? Right. Anybody else got any questions? No. Well, thank you so much, Felicity. That was an excellent talk.
I do apologise for the telephone call. I just said to both sons, don't ring me between 6 and 7. But obviously we're speaking the wrong language. Sorry about that.
Yeah. But I learned a hell of a lot today. I mean, that was marvellous. Very, very interesting.
Good.
And
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. No, thank you so much.
I'm delighted.
Well, as I said, this is. As I said, in a couple of weeks' time, we got Women in the First World War. We got part 1 and part 2 by Dr. John Sorrell.
I'd be interested.
He would be. I would recommend him.
Yeah.
So March is a ladies' month on classic battlefield tours. There we go.
Right. Okay.
Well, good night, all. And hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night, and thank you very much.